Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very timely and important discussion on slavery, colonialism, and the public realm. I'm Geraldine from the MA. I'll be facilitating this session. I'll shortly hand over to our chair, Gillian Findlay, who is the Curatorial and Engagement Manager at Museums Galleries Edinburgh. But first, I have a few short housekeeping announcements to make, so please bear with me if you've heard these before. Firstly, as attendees, your cameras and microphones aren't switched on, but you can use the chat function on your menu bar to introduce yourselves and join in the conversation. Please do keep sharing your experiences and links. You're also very welcome to tweet using the hashtag Museums2020. There is live closed captioning available at the bottom of your Zoom screens, as well as audio describing via the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Please switch to the French channel for the live audio description. If you have a question that you'd like the panel to address, then please share this via the Q&A function, which is also in the menu bar. The chair will put selected questions you've asked to the panel, so please keep these short and to the point to help her out. You can leave and rejoin the webinar at any time. We are recording this session and it will be available on our website in due course. And finally, please bear with us if there are any technical problems during the webinar. Just send me a private chat message if you have any troubles and I'll do my best to help. Right, now it's time to hand over to you, Gillian, to get started.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you loud and clear, Gillian. Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm having some internet problems, so I'm just hoping that this is going to work from my end, but I apologize now if I dip out and in. Hello and welcome. Thank you very much, Geraldine, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here this morning and to welcome everybody to our final day of conference and to if, like me, you've been attending conference throughout this week, you'll be aware that this is a topic which has inevitably featured in a number of earlier sessions. In the electric opening debate on Monday about Black Lives Matter, museums and anti-racism activity, during the fascinating discussion yesterday, which asked, what do we mean by decolonize? And again in the afternoon, in the powerful session about the purpose and the potential of museums to effect positive social change between Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, and David Lammy MP. And wow, what a session that was. It's absolutely fascinating and I think telling how discussions which so often begin with an inward-looking exploration of behaviours, practice and collections within museums so quickly and irresistibly reset on the deeply emotive historic symbols, busts and statues, which are sometimes inside, but more often outside the museum's walls, and which are located in the key locations across cityscapes in the UK. These proved during the summer of 2020 to be the lightning rods, really, the tangible, hugely evocative, almost magnetic gathering points for BLM campaigners. While those protests demanded a new, urgent and comprehensive re-evaluation of the figures, the families, the businesses and stories that these monuments glorify, and finally, acknowledgement of the many hundreds of thousands of stolen, untold histories they deny. It should be acknowledged that some cities had long since started on their path to recognise and redress the historic civic role profiting from and propping up the transatlantic slave trade and associated industries, as well as their impact, felt all too keenly now for people in terms of modern day racial inequality, community discord and discrimination in daily life. Some cities, as a result, are at a more mature stage in their discussions than others, and the sophistication or strategic nature of the resulting restorative action and policy decisions being taken. However, all are responding in a way which is unique to their context, 4 of which we will hear about shortly. And those, of course, are Bristol, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Liverpool. The eagle eyes and eared among you will have noticed we don't, however, have Cardiff, Swansea or Belfast represented here today. I acknowledge that omission, and as a Scot and a member of the MA's Nations Committee, which exists to ensure that all nations of the UK are fairly represented in our work and discourse, I regret their absence. Necessary restrictions today on speaker slots and the time we have available for debate means the discussion cannot be as comprehensive as I would have wished, but it does set the scene for future discussion and debate out with this forum, and perhaps at next year's conference, which is nation rather than city specific. And that discussion at the moment feels particularly important. Culture, of course, is a devolved matter. And here in Scotland, the SNP administration's latest programme for government commits to the development of an independent expert panel to be led by Sir Jeff Palmer to recommend how the country's existing and future museum collections can better recognise and represent a more accurate portrayal of Scotland's colonial and slavery history. Museums Galleries Scotland, which is the sector organisation national development body here, will be coordinating a national consultation in collaboration with Glasgow Live to establish public and expert perspectives, and a related research group will identify the work already in progress in this area in museums across the country. The history of slavery and the social, economic and cultural impact of colonialism are recognised as entrenched in Scotland's museums, collections and heritage sites. And the sector here is increasingly vocal in its commitment to show their full history. The Scottish Government's statement of intent and support for the sector to take an active, even activist approach to reviewing and opening up these histories was reported and widely welcomed in early September. In stark contrast, just a few weeks later, alarm was raised when national museums, galleries and other arm's length bodies in direct receipt of DCMS funding south of the border received a letter from the Westminster Government Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, outlining its approach to what it refers to as contested heritage, and its view that it doesn't support the removal of statues or other similar objects. The letter asks museums to notify the government of any activities in this area, implies that government funding may be withheld if museums do not comply, and denies museums the responsibility to take carefully considered decisions about contested heritage with its staff and with their communities. This, then, is the overtly politicised context in which discussions continue about slavery, colonialism, and the public realm, and within which our speakers are working today. It's my pleasure now and privilege to introduce each of them and their perspectives on the approach their cities have taken. Each will speak for about 5 minutes before we open the discussion to the floor, and we'll ask for questions, which I'm guessing there will be many. Please don't wait though until all the speakers have finished before you start to send your questions in. Feel free to use the Q&A facility if you haven't already. And my tech allowing, I'm having problems, you might have noticed, but my tech allowing, we'll get through as many questions as we can, time allowing, finishing with final reflections and thoughts from our speakers on the debate. So first up, you will hear from Tim Cole. Professor Tim Cole is a professor of social history at the University of Bristol and the founding director of the Brigstow Institute, which fosters new co-produced and interdisciplinary research partnerships. His main research area has been on Holocaust history and memory, and his most recent book is Holocaust Landscapes. But he also has interests in the environmental history that feature in his forthcoming book about Britain. Tim is chair in the Bristol History Commission. Next up, Lisa Williams will speak. Lisa is a freelance heritage consultant and educator, and she is the founder of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association. She leads Black History Walks in our capital. Lisa has a BA in African and Asian Studies, an MA in Arts, Festival and Cultural Management, and is an honorary fellow in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. Miles Greenwood is the newly appointed curator of the Legacies of Slavery and Empire at Glasgow Museums. Miles studied for an MA in Heritage Studies at Newcastle University, focusing on the role of Pan-Africanism in decolonisation, before returning to his hometown of Manchester to take a job with Maurice Hargreaves McIntyre. He was then appointed the Visitor Studies Officer at Paisley Museum, before taking up his current role with Glasgow Museums. Last, but certainly not least, Dr. Richard Benjamin heads the International Slavery Museum at National Museums Liverpool, where he's responsible for the strategic development of the museum, including its forthcoming capital transformation project, partnerships, research and collection policies. He's the co-director of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery, and Richard is also a trustee of the Anthony Walker Foundation. He's on the editorial board for Monitor, which is the Global Intelligence on Racism magazine, and he's a member of the Everton Football Club External Equality Advisory Group. So welcome all of our speakers. I'm delighted that you could form our panel today. Without further ado, I'll hand back over to Tim Coles to kick us off. Tim.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you for the invitation. I feel like a bit of an intruder, being someone who isn't involved in the museum sector, as my esteemed colleagues are, and as many of you are. What I could do maybe is just fill you in a little bit on, in a sense, I guess, why I'm here as someone who's not primarily involved in the museum sector, but is working very closely with Bristol Culture team, John Finch, who heads that up, as part of this history commission. And I think it points to the way that, in some ways, Bristol's position has been to try and broaden and deepen debate and engagement with not just the public realm, but also with public history in the aftermath of the toppling of the Edward Colston statue. As many of you know, I'm sure that in a sense, Bristol's been doing work around this subject area for a long time. I think the most important and significant intervention that's taken place in the last year or so has been the appointment of a legacy commission, which is chaired by the Deputy Mayor, Asher Craig, and includes representatives, members of the Black community in the city. And that commission is specifically looking at the question of what Bristol does in its public realm to commemorate and memorialise and mark Bristol's involvement in the transatlantic slave economy. And so, in a sense, there's a separate piece of work that's already been started pre the toppling of the statue to think hard about what it would look like for us as a city to be much more self-consciously memorialising the impact of the slave trade on Black communities. And so that piece of work is ongoing, but I think in the aftermath of the toppling of the Colston statue, the sense from the city mayor, Marvin Rees, was that this was an opportunity for us as a city to take a sort of longer and deeper look at our past, and to do that in a sort of collective way. And I think one of the things that's been interesting about the way that the mayor's responded to the toppling of the statue is, in a sense, to say, actually, this is an opportunity for us to pause and to think not just about the public realm, but, as I said, to think about public history more broadly. And so the thing that we're doing as a history commission is really inviting the city into a citywide conversation. We're working very closely with Bristol Culture and the museum sector in that. And I guess that's one thing I'm really interested in, is that sense in some ways of the kind of turning the walls of the museum inside out, and the ways in which museums and academics and communities can work really fruitfully together in having a broader citywide conversation. Now, it's easier said than done to have a broad citywide conversation, but that's very much the ambition of the commission, is to take a number of what we hope will be really provocative and useful questions to focus the conversation in a city that is talking about its past. Because of the events of the summer, and the toppling of the statue, in a sense, it's a right time for a city to have this conversation, because everyone's talking about the past, and in particular, the question of the involvement of Bristol within the slave economy, and also I think critical questions about who's memorialised in the city and who's not memorialised in the city. And so what we'll do as a commission is we'll invite the city into a series of conversations around the questions, starting off with what have we remembered in the city, and that isn't just a kind of audit of the public realm, but is much more, in some ways I almost see it as a kind of an equipping a city to be almost like memorial or statue detectives. So to provide the kind of literacy, the sort of memorial literacy for individuals in the city to ask really critical questions about, well, actually, who has ended up on the streets of the city, what names and what people have ended up on the streets of the city, who put them there, and what do we as a city now want to do with those? And also, I think, to celebrate and to unearth the kind of critical sort of DIY guerrilla memorialization that's taken place within the city over the last 2 or 3 decades. One of the things I'd love us to develop as a commission is almost like a DIY kit for guerrilla memorialization that pays due attention to planning law and the roles of city councils in navigating public space, but also in a sense encourages memorialization as a bottom-up and not just a top-down initiative, and brings that to the fore. And then I'm conscious of time, I'll finish. One thing maybe I can just sketch out is a kind of the trajectory is really for us to then invite the city to think about the question of where we've come from, partly family history, in particular, I think histories of migration, the sense that anyone in a city is an economic migrant, that we arrive at different times in cities, but most of us come from somewhere else, largely for economic reasons. What have we manufactured? And there, obviously, the role of tobacco and sugar in the chocolate industry in Bristol directly links us to the transatlantic slave economy. But it also is about the growth of Bristol as a city for the creative industries and the knowledge economy in the late 20th and early 21st century. Have we lived and died? Good old-fashioned social history. What have we believed? Around faith and politics, and then to finish with what have we fought for and what have we fought about, because I think one thing that is really important in these discussions is to engage the city as well in reflection on the fact that we've not always been agreed as a city. And I think one of the touchstones in Bristol was around abolition in the early 19th century, where the city was very much divided between those who were abolitionists and those who wanted the slave trade to continue. But that sense of a city in conflict is one that continues all the way through to, for example, Brexit in the much more recent past. And then my hope is that after we've kind of had this period, if you like, of inviting a city into a conversation about its past, that we can then ask, well, what do we want to remember now? And to really think about actually what of this past do we want to remember? How do we want to remember it? What kind of interventions do we want to make within the public realm? So in a sense, I think, Julian, this has been a chance for us to kind of broaden conversation and to try and think about what would it look like for a city to explore its history together.
Tim, thank you so much. There's so many aspects of what you've just said that I think we could have a session about in its own right. It's absolutely fascinating to hear what's happening in Bristol. And I love the idea of a DIY toolkit. That's just fabulous idea to help involve more people in these discussions and to participate in their heritage. We will come back to some of those, I've no doubt at all, but for now we're going to move straight on, and it's my great pleasure to hand over to Lisa Williams. Lisa, hello.
Hi, morning Gillian, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'll try and also pack an awful lot into the next 5 minutes. So what I would add to your introduction is that my mother's from the Caribbean. I've got a long sort of heritage going back on one side to lots of different areas. I spent 20 years in the Caribbean, and being involved in the conversations on that end has equipped me to understand a lot of the gaps that we're not seeing in the museums and in the kind of conversations that we're having here. So I'm often in a position where I'm bringing those conversations together, if you like, in different ways. So I've been involved in a huge range of conversations over the last few years. So talks in the communities, but also work in schools and speaking to teachers and understanding their sort of hesitancies and fears around addressing some of these issues and not feeling equipped. And there's sort of been, I would say, mixed reactions amongst teachers as to the the persevering legacies of that period as well, when it even comes to understanding race and teaching about those things, and in multicultural classrooms particularly. I had a lot of conversations with curators and people who are involved in interpretation in museums across a lot of different institutions across Scotland. And a lot of the, again, the themes and the fears tend to be the same kind of thing. A lot of fear around language, a lot of lack of confidence about addressing some of these things. And then, of course, within certain institutions, you'll see people who have a huge range of ideas. So some people trying to push a very progressive agenda, quite a radical agenda, maybe not having the power within that institution to do that. And then, of course, at the larger institutions, the difficulties of being able to push through change in quite unwieldy organizations as well. So I would second a lot of what Tim has already said about trying to make sure that we have conversations across the board. And what I see in a place like Edinburgh, it can be quite segregated in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of who's involved in these or has been involved in these conversations up to now. And that's really important that we try and bridge those gaps, because people tend to be in silos. We've got the kind of academic silo happening. Again, I would second that idea about really pushing public history and making sure people are well informed and have access to really credible information about things as well. So Scotland's approach since 2007, there's been a huge amount of work across Scotland in this, but again, it hasn't always filtered into the areas that it should have done. There were two Edinburgh historians that were very much involved in the 2007 commemorations. And I know the booklet at that time, some of their work had sort of been softened at that period, even though there were people in Edinburgh at that time making very, very good points, which is a shame. Glasgow has been more ahead, I think. I'm sure Glasgow people here probably agree with me. Glasgow's been more ahead. Edinburgh's, you know, trying to catch up, I think, in some ways. I also think there's a specific issue with the Scottish context, of course, the idea of Scots as victims, not as involved in transatlantic slave trade. Those ideas are still reasonably current, even though it's beginning to change now. Of course, the abolition movement here was really strong as well. That's something that it's important for people to know about, and they don't necessarily know about that either. There's a certain denial in Edinburgh, I think, as well, about the involvement in terms of even in the compensation that previous enslavers received. Edinburgh's overrepresented on that list, for example. So it tends to be a bit more subtle. Some of the legacies in Edinburgh perhaps showing up more in things like, say, insurance or banking, or the types of industries that maybe are a little bit harder to see those strong benefits, but also in the infrastructure here as well. So things like the university, things like educational institutions, even railways, you know, those kinds of things. When I take people around on Black History Walks of Edinburgh, they're quite shocked at the levels of benefits coming in that people are still using today in the infrastructure that we have. So a lot of the touch point in the last few years, the flashpoint has been around the Melville Monument in the centre of St Andrew's Square. So Geoffrey Palmer has been doing tireless work on bringing people's attention to his role as an extremely powerful politician in Scotland, his role in delaying the abolition of the slave trade. But also, when I take people around on tours, I will talk about the role, let's say, of Melville and other people, even like the Prime Minister, organising the biggest military mission that's ever left Britain and gone out to invade Haiti and reinstate chattel slavery, and those kinds of things that people are quite shocked by when they come on the tours. So there was a petition put out by somebody who's actually descendant of the Scottish aristocracy, who wanted some more light shed on this in 2016. There's been a committee over the last few years sort of thrashing out what might go onto a plaque, a new plaque telling a bit more of a truthful story about Melville's role. For me, I think personally, it would have been better if there'd been a bit more transparency from that point and more people were involved in that conversation from the beginning. And I think you would have got more people involved and maybe not as much kickback as there have been in some areas. Of course, the Black Lives Matter protest this year, and one of the protests was actually at the bottom of that statue, so linking present day racism in Scotland, linking it back to the legacy of that period. which has been great because it's meant that it's really brought the conversation to the fore. What I find interesting about here is the new plan for the new advisory board. Like you were saying, the Scottish Government's way of approaching it is very, very different. It allows for a lot more freedom. It allows for a lot more freedom of conversation, even in teaching anti-racist work and that kind of thing as well. The fact that the council are now planning a review of all of these statues across Edinburgh, and also the fact that it's going to be a three-pronged approach. So talking about school curriculum, talking about museums, and also the interpretation of the public realm. And it's very important that those things are all coming together. I also found it interesting that Museum Galleries Scotland's press release did actually mention that some of this is a reaction to the activism of Black Lives Matter, and that not being an issue for the government. But like I said, I think we have a wonderful opportunity to really go forward and do something very constructive. I think it's really important that we have as much transparency as possible in these kinds of conversations, and we think about it as a dialogue, we think about it as conversation rather than this idea of debates, polarizing and sometimes quite toxic debates, which are unnecessary. Thank you.
Sorry, you all have to bear with me. I'm having a terrible tech day. Lisa, thank you so much. There's, again, so much to consider there. And I love your points about the importance of transparency and also that very important differentiation between dialogue and debate, and one being much more confrontational than the other, which tends to be quite positive and focused on problem solving. So some really important points there. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move straight on now, and I'd like to introduce Miles Greenwood. It's a delight to have you here, Miles, with possibly one of the most envied job roles in Scotland today. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Jill, and thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone for tuning in today. As Jill mentioned, I've recently been appointed as the curator of the Legacies of Slavery and Empire, which is an ideal job for me personally. It means a lot, and I'm really delighted to be in post. My role will involve working with colleagues and with the public to share knowledge about the impact of slavery and the British Empire on Glasgow. I think we can all agree, and Lisa mentioned how Glasgow's long been going through a process of understanding how deep the connections the city has to slavery and empire are, how tobacco and sugar lords enrich themselves and the city. So to help people sort of continue on that journey, the aim is to sort of develop a public program of collaborative research and an overall strategy for how we can address the legacies of slavery and colonialism across the museum surface, and also embed it in our practice going forward. Of course, to do this, we want to be led by our audiences, our partners, and our communities, because for me, when it comes to these histories, it's the only thing that really makes sense. And that's because colonialism and slavery have shaped the UK, Scotland, and Glasgow as we know them. Colonialism isn't a thing of the past. It's impacted people who are alive today. It still impacts people's lives across the world. And those voices need to be heard, and those interpretations need to be part of the project. Indeed, many of the problems we face today, whether racism, inequality, or police brutality, are the products of colonialism and slavery. So it's important that we, across the museum sector and as a society, make the connection between the past, the present, and people. And that's a crucial part of what we at Glasgow Museums hope to achieve. And obviously for me, starting in 2020, it's a bizarre time. We have an international pandemic. I've met very few of my colleagues in person, so there's obviously challenges with that. And of course, even greater challenges trying to work people out with the museum, but it's still a really important thing that we try to do. And as well, a tragic thing that happened in 2020 is the murder of George Floyd. And of course, there was a whole wave of protests around the world that erupted as a result. And tied to that is the toppling of the Colston statue. And all these things have added new levels of attention for me and all of us who are involved in addressing issues around racism and the legacies of colonialism and slavery. And while the circumstances and the root of that are tragic, the added levels of interest isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it's important to realize that racism didn't start with the murder of George Floyd. And people didn't just start talking about toppling the Colston statue this summer. There's been polite requests, petitions, and protests for a long period of time. And Black people have loudly been fighting against racism since people began being enslaved and dehumanized because of the color of their skin. I think what the real tragedy is it's taken this long for people to really start listening. And I think history plays a crucial role in that. The dehumanization and the racial hierarchies that were created to justify the oppression and exploitation of human beings are a crucial reason why people of color, and particularly Black people, have been marginalized for centuries. So we as individuals, as a society, and as museums have to understand the conditions that enabled those voices to be ignored, and we then have to dismantle them. The positive, I think, is that I believe there's a real appetite to do this. We've been working on displays at Goma and Riverside that are in place at the moment. Our education team have been doing workshops on slavery for quite a while. The University of Glasgow have last year they completed doing research into how they benefited from slavery and announced a programme of reparations for up to £20 million, which I think is a real historic step in itself. The investment that MGS have put in the creation of My Role, and also their investment in the Huntarians Curating Discomfort project, and also them leading on a national consultation on how we can better address these legacies as a nation, shows a genuine willingness to meaningfully address these histories. And also hearing from all you at this conference has given me confidence that there is a real collective determination to tackle the problems that we all face. So I'd just like to finish by saying that I'm excited and I'm hopeful for the future. There's of course a lot of work to be done, but it's clear that there's a real desire to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. I think you're absolutely right. It's clear there is a real appetite, and that's evident not least in the excitement within the sector, I think, at your post being created and your appointment personally. So I'm anticipating the future, hoping we can have you back at conference next year to tell us about how you've got on, but also I'm sure we'll be hearing about you what's been happening before then. Glasgow is so well known for its audience-led and community-focused participatory approaches, so it's no surprise to hear that you're keen, despite the restrictions currently, to see that take place in your own practice. Great to meet you. Thank you. Now, last but certainly not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Benjamin from Liverpool Museums. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Gillian. I appreciate the invitation to speak. So I will keep this brief so we can get into the important Q&A and discussion section. Look, you mentioned in the introduction I was a trustee of the Anthony Walker Foundation, and you know, if there was one place to start to give you an idea for those of you that don't know about our kind of focus and our viewpoint as a museum, it's to talk about our relationship with not only the Anthony Walker Foundation, which I've been proud to be a trustee for 10 years now, but working closely with members of the family. Anthony's mother, G. Walker, and Dominique Walker, his sister. Anthony, young Black man murdered in a racially motivated attack in 2006, and we named one of our education bases the Anthony Walker Education Centre, and it's had hundreds of thousands of young people who visited that since we opened in 2007. So we actively engage in real-time local and national issues. It's in our DNA, and as being involved with the Anthony Walker Foundation means we're actively tackling hate crime within the city and in other parts of the country. And in fact, we're one of the only museums, along with the Museum of Liverpool, who's in the same family of museums, who are a third-party hate crime reporting centre. And I think that's a pretty innovative thing to do. And I urge other museums who aren't to try to do something really active like that. So if you want to fight hate crime or be part of the fight against it, do something like applying to be a third-party hate crime reporting centre. So look, let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing as a museum and an organisation, but you know, I'm talking from the perspective of the International Slave Museum here. There's been a convergence of narratives for us in the past 2 months in particular. Obviously, statues and the built environment and whether or not they should be removed and where they should be taken and whether museums should be some kind of elephant's graveyard for these types of statues, in a sense, which is not something I'm particularly keen on. Equally, if museums did get involved and were to take some of these statues, you know, if more people are going to engage with the subject matter, and I see museums as being portals for people, then maybe that's a discussion. And, you know, Miles just talked about Colston then, and, you know, we were contacted very shortly after, in fact, on the day when it was toppled and thrown into the dock, people were contacting us and saying, are you going to take the statue? And I said, well, no, hold on, you know, there's a Bristol discussion. As Miles just said, there's been a discussion for many years. These are not new discussions. The media might kind of take them on board and everyone thinks they're new. They're not. They've been existing in the cities and towns that many of the panel members are from here for many, many years. But museums have a really active role in that, and you need to be part of that discussion as part of a civic discussion. Same for street names. Street name discussions in many cities, Glasgow particularly and Liverpool, have been ongoing for many years. And Tim mentioned the guerrilla street signs. I think that's a really great example, and I've seen examples of that when I've been to Glasgow. So, you know, should cities be renaming streets, or at the very least contextualizing them more? Because this is part of the issue, that at the moment statues and street names that have a connection to Britain's colonial past and its empire and its involvement in the slave trade, there's very little interpretation or information around them, and that's a big issue. So the Colston statue was toppled because there'd been enough talk, and sometimes people take things into their own hands. So you're not advocating criminal damage, but how long would that conversation have gone on? Maybe a few more years. And I often say to people, you know, I give them an answer as the head of a museum, and I talk about, look, you know, we need to contextualize and being part of the civic debate. But equally, I give them a response as a dad. Okay, I have 2 kids. And, you know, when I walk through the streets of Liverpool, obviously I'm familiar with many of the streets and who they're named after. And there is a side of it that thinks, how progressive is it for a city that you still have names of streets named after individuals that, quite frankly, you would be embarrassed to tell your child what they did. They haven't done anything that's positive for the city. So, like I said, these are citywide discussions. I'm not going to tell Bristol what to do or Glasgow, but I do think people have a say in whether you, at the very minimum, add more interpretation to street names, or whether there are other things you can do as well. Most of the speakers have mentioned Black Lives Matter and whether museums and the sector is responding to this. And in one sense, that slightly annoys me because, you know, in one sense, you shouldn't have to respond to this. You shouldn't have to have another senseless murder happen for you to then release a statement. So let's see how many statements from some of the nationals are out there in 6 months' time. So as an organisation, we've been not just focusing on ISM, but the other museums in the organisations. What is their responses? And we're in different places. We're a big organisation. We're not all the same. It's not homogenous. So being anti-racist, challenging issues such as hate crime, is part of the DNA of ISM, and that's partly to do with the experiences and the personal backgrounds of members of the ISM team, myself included. And that doesn't always happen at other museums. So it can be a difficult journey for them to start. You know, how does an organisation become anti-racist? Well, yeah, you can make a statement, you can send people on mandatory training, but equally, and I've said this many times, it's actually a lot of responsibilities on the individual. So lots of you watching this today, and this is my opinion, but lots of you watching this today will be from organisations who want to be, you know, you've listened to a lot of sessions this week and do something active and take it forward and maybe have some new policies. Yeah, and that's great and that's needed, but you need to take responsibility yourself. Okay, you might have colleagues that have personal experiences that might put things into context. You might have someone who says to you, go to this museum, they have an exhibition that might help you. But if you don't, you need to take that responsibility and you need to go out there and seek your own information and find out how you and your organisation can be anti-racist. I'll just finish on this. How do we challenge some of these issues in Liverpool? Well, it's definitely not just from the museum itself, of course it's not. And in Liverpool, there's been it's a 50-odd year plus discussion with members of the community about what the museum and the cultural sector should do. It isn't a new discussion. National Museums Liverpool has been engaged with various conversations, various community leaders, community groups for decades. The International Slavery Museum, since 2008 specifically, has what's called a respect group, and that is an advisory group that has senior members of the museum staff, myself included, and our director now, Laura Pye, who chairs that, and other senior members of staff from various departments. So there's a lot of access to that group from members of the public, but you've got community leaders on that group, local historians, members of the police force, members of the city council, because if you are going to make change, then you need to listen to what people want to do. But equally, then you need people who are able to bring about that change. You know, it may sound boring, but you need the planners involved if you're going to change a street name. You know, so I'm a pragmatist. So it's great that you have people saying you need to make change. Now's the time for change. Equally, you need to get the people around the table as well who are able to actually bring that change about. So we don't do anything at the Slavery Museum without having many critical friends guide us on our journey. And if you haven't got critical friends from the community, I say to you, find out who those friends are. If they're engaged and interested, then they'll sometimes be critical of what you do, but they're doing that to make you a better place for the public to visit. So maybe the conversation will go into this realm, but you can't do anything on your own. Okay, museums are not islands. They need to be something that talks to other civic members of the city and other organisations and bodies, but it needs to speak to the people first and foremost. So I'll finish there, Gillian.
Wow, thank you, Richard, so much. There's tens and tens of points there that, again, we could just have whole sessions about. It's absolutely fascinating. There's so much to consider there. Oh, can I bring back all of our other panelists now? I'm delighted that our colleagues here participating, watching the session, have been firing in some fabulous questions. And I'm going to start to push to you all to discuss and to offer your responses. Before I do, and just to pick up immediately on Richard's point, and a point that we've covered a little bit with some of the other speakers, I just want to kick off by asking, in light of the recent and controversial political intervention in these matters, my question is, given we're agreed there needs to be wide discussion, and change makers, the people able to facilitate change, need to be present. My question is specifically, who ought to make the decisions about changes in the public realm? Where should that authority lie? Should it be at national level, local level, or with specific institutions? And is it inevitable, do you think, that in the process, heritage is going to be weaponized during that process? I might ask Tim to kick us off and then encourage my other colleagues to jump in.
I mean, my sense in Bristol is that the position is very much that this needs to be a local decision. That I think it's about the city making those decisions, and that is very much why all of this activity is going on, which is attempting to be very inclusive of taking the city's voices on board. And I think one thing that was really important that Richard mentioned was that my sense in Bristol was that people just got bored of conversation dragging on and on for years. You know, as many of you know, I think there's been an attempt to explain the Colston statue and to kind of contextualize it and to create a plaque that would situate Colston and his activities, which has run for like 3 years, I think, because there was disagreement about what exact words to put on a plaque, because there was conflict over that. And in a sense, I think some people just got bored of that and said, actually, let's just get rid of this thing. We haven't got any time to waste or wait for a plaque to appear. And I think that is a challenge to us, all of us that are involved in museums or in universities, within culture teams, is that actually I think we need to deliver. And I think that needs to be delivery that's done at a local level at cities rather than a national level.
Thank you, Tim. Sorry, on you go.
No, I just agree absolutely with what Tim said. It's local first and foremost, and these issues are national, but you need to be having those local conversations. We say about having conversations with community groups, don't we? And what that means, and equally, that's you know, sometimes people kind of think there's 10 people sat in a room all the time. It's not. It's not homogenous. It's diverse. There's politics. There's all sorts of things converging. You can't speak to everybody, but you can speak to key people as a starting point. So there are, you know, local historians, key activists. It's a way in. It's a portal, do you know? And more people may come around the table. But you need your mayor. You need the chief of staff. You need the planners. You need the museums. And then you need your community voices, because they can speak on behalf of many people that the museums and the you know, civic bodies might not speak to. And then so everyone needs to have a say, but there's the people need to be able to do it as well. And as Tim said, there's a lot of talk and there isn't always a lot of action, you know. So just saying, in Liverpool now we do have a task force after many years, but there is a task force now that is looking at developing the interpretation for at least 10 of the streets in the city. So a long time coming, but at least it's actually in place at the moment. And we're part of that, along with, like I said, a lot of community leaders and the mayor's office. So it's a step forward.
Yeah, I'll just add that I agree with both Richard and Tim. I think what happened in Bristol shown that ultimately power does lie with people. I mean, if people come together and decide that they're going to make a change, then that change can be made. The question is how us as institutions respond to that with our own decision making. And I think that's where it is important, as Richard said, to have those people around the table, to have them embedded in your decision making process. So you are constantly aware of the conversations that are happening, and these things don't catch you by surprise, and you can respond to them as institutions.
Okay. Can I come in there?
Absolutely, Lisa. Thank you.
Just add a couple of things to that, because I generally agree with the points that have been made. I think sometimes an issue with the more conservative voices often are the ones that are invited to come around the table. So it's making sure that the radical voices are also have a chance to be included. There also this, you know, there's quite a split I see in Edinburgh between the youth and elders in what should be done. So making sure that young voices are definitely included in, and how, you know, making sure you use all sorts of different avenues to reach people, whether that's a notice on a library board somewhere, or that's Instagram or whatever, but making sure that all of those things are covered. Also, for me, what's important is how we manage people trying to co-opt the narrative in really toxic and hostile ways. So those loudest voices are often with an agenda, and you see people up here sometimes sort of allied on Twitter with some people who, for example, like a Force for Good, and the leader of the Force for Good is a Holocaust denier, for example. And you see people who will probably consider themselves publicly to be quite moderate, sort of aligning with those people on social media. I think it's important that we need to understand who's behind and who's funding these kinds of organisations, what the agenda is, so that it's easier to go forward without the narrative constantly being co-opted. And that's a question I'd quite like to ask the panel, if we get into that kind of discussion, actually the rest of the panel, like what you think, especially this year with young white people getting on board with activism and seeing that kind of cross-racial allyship happening more, how we can actually optimize that kind of allyship, if you want to call it that, to make sure that also people are protected when they're speaking out on things like social media, or whether you decide you're going to use a young Black intern to approach the kind of problematic and controversial stuff without any emotional scaffolding for them within the organisation, or whether you've got support for them, and whether you're thinking about the kinds of attacks that might happen to that person on and offline on things like social media as well. So I think those kinds of ideas of safety, if those are things are put in place, that's going to encourage different voices to come in who need to be heard.
Any thoughts from other panelists about that?
I'm happy to say a few things. Lisa mentioned emotional scaffolding there, didn't you? Which is an interesting phrase. No, you're quite right. I mean, look, you know, I'm head of a slavery museum, and the team I head work on difficult and sensitive issues every single day. And you know, we're often the first point of call for people, you know, particularly the media, because it's like, oh, okay, you know, who can we speak to? Oh, the Slavery Museum is the Black Museum, yeah? And we know that's not the case, and it's more complex than that. What do? Do you turn the media away, or do you actually think, you know, it's a platform to get the message across? So I always think, look, was it, you know, all media's, you know, good media in a sense, if you use it in the right way. So you're talking about different voices, young white people in particular, who get engaging with the subject matter. What I'd like to see is more older white people maybe engaging with it as well. You know, look what's happening in the US. You know what I mean? There's a big difference on who votes and what their views are. So in one sense, I think it's harder to get more established and more entrenched views to think broadly than it is to younger people. You need to give them a platform. Obviously, social media, things like that, are a big factor, you know, these days. But yeah, staff need to be protected in a way, because it's easy to have a dig at them because you are putting yourselves out there. Again, I can't speak for everyone. In Liverpool, in NML, we have a staff group for Black members of staff. That's been there since 2007. I'm the co-founder of that, and that's still very active. And, you know, first and foremost, sometimes first point of call is each other. You know, it's kind of, you know, just checking in, seeing how we're all doing with each other, because that's not always the same around all aspects of the organisation. But again, there's been great strides in Liverpool, you know, and it's a very ongoing and real-time discussion. The staff group has led on that for many years. It's always been very vocal and it has a voice. So one thing, again, practically, I would say, if you don't have staff groups and your diverse members of staff don't have a forum where they can feel safe, get one. You know, it's a good starting point. So that's just, you know, one example from Liverpool.
Thank you, Richard. Miles or Tim, I don't know if you want to come in. You don't have to. We've got lots of questions, but it's up to you.
I think I'd agree with Lisa. I think it's so key that I think we all have to sort of educate ourselves and share knowledge in terms of not to homogenize the experiences of particularly people of colour. I think sometimes you can sort of approach one person and be like, oh, well, this person's a representative of an entire group that have widely different views. And even when it comes to histories of slavery and colonialism, we have such different perspectives and different experiences of them on individual basis. I mean, even within my family, my grandma, who's Windrush generation Jamaican, is much more conservative when it comes to criticizing the British Empire than I am as a third generation. I'm far more radical than she is. And it's just so, these views are so complex, but it doesn't mean that her view's less or more valid than mine. I think it's that we have to try and understand how wide-ranging these views are and perspectives before we can act based on them.
Thank you, Miles. Tim, unless you want to come in, I'll ask another question, because we've got some crackers here. I'll jump in. So Antonia Phillips asks, the idea of a Black British Museum was brought up earlier this week, a brilliant session chaired by Sandra Shakespeare. Do you think this could be a forum to tell the stories of those who were once silenced? And I know, Miles, this was an issue that you were interested in too, about centering those stories rather than the stories of abolitionists or the statue subjects themselves. What are your thoughts about that and a Black British Museum?
Oh, I'll kick off for what it's worth. I spent a lot of time in the US when I was studying many years ago. And I spent a lot of time working with professionals who worked for African American museums, or Black museums as they called them themselves. And I spent a lot of time in archaeology departments. That's my trade originally, with African American archaeologists. Since the 60s and the growth of civil rights movement and activism, they've explicitly called museums and both departments African American or Black, and we don't do that as much in the UK. You know, we don't have a discipline of Black British archaeology, for instance, where you could have that. It's something I was promoting when I was studying in the 90s, and we still don't have one. So a Black History Museum, I think it'd be a really good idea. Equally, at the end of the day, there's a lot of national museums, a lot of museums that are represented here today. It should be obviously a key thread of everyone's narrative, but you know, it's like Black History Month. We're not in an ideal world, are we? You shouldn't have Black History Month, but we need it still to some degree, because there's loads of people, maybe in all due respect, say Devon or Norfolk or various places that might not have, large black diverse communities there. So it's still needed in places that are a lot more, conservative and more middle class, that don't engage with these issues. So it is a good idea, I think, because you sometimes have to be really explicit for people. But I don't think that could, in one sense, allow some museums to take a back seat. And you have to be very careful that people don't go, oh yeah, the black stuff, that's down there, we're going to do that. Because that means other museums get away from it. We have the British Museum, we have national museums, and I think it's their role to be part of that narrative as well. The International Slavery Museum talks about the black experience as well. I personally do not think you can not connect the two. For me, it's about portals, gateways, and signposts. So we have to talk about broader issues of the black experience when you're talking about transatlantic slavery. Our focus in Liverpool is chattel slavery and transatlantic slavery. That's where we go into it. But equally, another museum might start in the 60s or the 80s. So I don't think you can not marry the two. I think it's where you focus your entry point of that. But it's an interesting idea, and we shouldn't just think of London if that is the case.
Absolutely. Anybody else? No, in that case, I'll ask another question. Statues, this is from Rhiannon Edgell. She says statues are arguably more visible representations of the presence of slavery. How do you go about highlighting the hidden traces of slavery and colonialism, for example, in buildings and in inherited wealth? Any takers for that?
I mean, I think that. Oh, can you hear me okay there, Gillian? Yeah. I think that is something that, there's I've just been looking at the chat and in the Q&A, and I think people are talking about things, for example, like walking tours. There's kind of a long history of that, I think, isn't there, in a sense of like actually in many of our cities, certainly that's the case in Bristol. I think I saw the referencing to Glasgow miles about that in many of our cities, there's a sense there that actually this is part of the story, isn't it? Which is that a walking tour is a live reinterpretation of the built environment of a city, and that points out where the wealth came from to build. So I think that stuff is already happening. In some places it's happening with a kind of digital overlay. So using the kind of digital overlay to kind of layer the stories of a history of a city, or the Know Your Place stuff that's been developed by Pete Insall and his team at Bristol, which has been widely adopted, which is about historic mapping layers and pointing out the kind of bigger stories behind things. So I feel like there's a lot going on there. So in a sense, I don't know, maybe I'm like Richard, I'm quite a sort of glass half full pragmatist kind of person, which is to actually celebrate in some ways actually that activity is happening. And I suppose for us the question is, how can we increase the volume of that? How can we turn the volume up of that and make it more accessible and available to people?
Yeah, that's super, Tim, thank you.
Just on the walking tour, sorry, just to say, if people haven't been, I mean, walking tours, and I think Lisa mentioned it, they're marvellous ways of navigating the cityscape, and for those people who've never been, and there's a marvellous one in Amsterdam, for instance, that's given by a number of local historians and members of the black community there, and I thoroughly advise people to go, and that's same as in New York. And in Liverpool, they were two key voices, community activists over the years, who were instrumental in developing the museum. Dorothy Kuya, sadly, who's passed, and she was a good friend of the museum, and Eric Lynch, members of the black community who gave the first slavery-related tours around Liverpool's city. And they were not museum tours, but they were endorsed by us and said to people, if you want to learn about Liverpool's history, go and speak to somebody from the community first and get their point of view. And then there's a museum that you can come to as well. So they're really interesting ways of doing this.
Just to pick one what Richard said, when I was little, I went on a tour with Eric Lynch of Liverpool, and it completely changed the way that I viewed cities, built heritage. For the rest of my life, I still always think about that tour. And also Lisa gives excellent tours of Edinburgh as well, just to sort of pick up on a thing. I think it's a really good way of understanding how our built environment has links to colonialism and slavery.
Thank you, Miles. Panelists, I'm so sorry. I've seen that Geraldine's given me a nudge that we are running out of time. And I'm so sorry, we've got so many questions that we would like to go through, but I only actually have time to thank all of you so much for your participation. I'm really hoping we can reconvene in another forum soon to continue the discussion. But thank you everybody for your questions, and thank you our panelists for taking part today. It's been brilliant. Cheers.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us for that. That was just brilliant. It was so valuable to hear all of your reflections, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. There's been a brilliant chat going on in the background. So just to give everyone a moment now, if you want to copy and paste that chat, grab it now, because there's some really useful information and links in there. Then the next thing to say is we've got, let me just get my notes. We've got a session on reopening the doors next. So that will reflect on what museums have learned from their experiences of reopening after lockdown. And I'm sure they'll also be looking at the challenges of closing again. So that starts at 11. And don't forget that our MA Virtual Hub is open from 11 to 4 today. So do drop by if you'd like to meet other delegates and MA staff for a face-to-face chat. It's a really great opportunity to network. Just to say thank you again to all our panelists, and goodbye.